Marek, welcome to the podcast. It's a long overdue connection for us.
Isn't it just? But we got there, and some things are worth waiting for.
Yeah, I think we initially thought that maybe the whole epidemic was one of the reasons why things delayed, and then off air we've just realised that we both have 10-month-old sons, so that's added another element to the mix.
Well, exactly. It's always nice to touch base beforehand and decide, what should we talk about today, and actually spend quite a while before we even touch on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So our topic today is around adrenal function and the adrenal hormone. And we are going to be touching on later episodes on some of the other hormones, because obviously there's an intimate dance that happens between the hormones in this system. But before we dive into that, are you happy just to share with our listeners, if they're not yet familiar with you, a little bit about who you are, what you do, and what you've done?
Yeah, so I am, what would be described as a functional nutritional therapist. So I see humans, make assessments of what may be standing between them and their goals, and then make recommendations on how they can make changes to achieve those goals. And I've been doing it 16 years. So in that time, it has been very much a journey of learning not only what are the areas that require my focus, but equally, what testing procedures are likely to uncover the information that we need. And added to that, countless audits of results and substratification of who needs what. And that's allowed me to put together a model of personalized nutrition, which of course is where things are currently at in the way I deal with things. So I hope that's a reasonable summary of where I'm at with things.
Yeah, it's nice to know that you see humans.
I do see humans, So all the good, all the bad that comes with working with humans, the whole gamut.
Brilliant. And I guess in some ways, talking about how our clinical practice, our knowledge, our understanding progresses, arguably adrenal function is a pretty good one in regards to how things have evolved to some degree. I can think back to when I started as a nutritional therapist 12 or so years ago, and I was certainly taught a very simplistic model of adrenal function, and I think things have very much changed there. And it was only probably maybe 3 years ago where the paper came out talking about how adrenal fatigue is a myth, and how it doesn't exist. So there's certainly a lot of confusion out there around adrenal testing and whether we should be thinking about adrenal function. So just, I guess, to put the ball in your court, how do you feel is a good way to kind of start this conversation and dive into it?
Well, I think it's a very pertinent subject that you mentioned, this phrase of adrenal fatigue, because it's not a phrase that I like, because as with all of these labels, it can mean different things for different people. So obviously very well aware that, yes, we've got this idea that has come from mainstream medicine over recent decades, that somehow, unlike any other hormonal system, that adrenal function only comes in 3 flavors: normal, Cushing's disease where it's high, Addison's disease where it's low, and there's just absolutely nothing in between. So that would be a fairly extraordinary way for the adrenals to behave. And spoiler alert, that's not how it happens. But of course, at the same time, we've then had this discussion that's been ongoing, rehashed, and continually brought to the fore about adrenal fatigue isn't real. Well, I have adrenal fatigue, so how can you say that? And it all gets very emotive very quickly, which doesn't tend to help us with our understanding. So in that sense, let's touch on this particularly interesting article. So this is a 2016 article, and it was a so-called systematic review. I mean, to be fair, it was a systematic review. The only reason that I'm phrasing it in that term is because in order to prove that adrenal fatigue doesn't exist, these two researchers in the BMC, they simply ran a study on the Cochrane database for adrenal fatigue, clinical burnout, adrenal exhaustion. Now, guess what? They didn't find any results, and therefore they concluded, well, it can't be real. But of course, it's just word games, in the sense that if I put tummy ache into the same databases, well, guess what? You're not going to find anything. If I put headache into that, you're not going to find these things. Dicky knee, that's not a thing either. So of course, this is where, if anybody should be interested, I can provide dozens upon dozens of references for varieties of adrenal function and the ways in which it can hamper optimal metabolism. So it's not a controversial subject. There's absolutely no issue here that we're spotting things that don't actually occur in the literature. But the easiest thing of all, if somebody wants to know, well, who's right here? Is it feasible that my adrenal hormones may be out of whack or impacting on various symptoms and patterns? You can just test them. And then they just don't need to worry about picking a team. It's very easy to empirically determine where you're at. So in that regard, I don't mind using the term. It's not one I really like, because it implies that you either have it or you don't. And the reality is, adrenal function, like everything else, can be impacted on multiple different ways. And that's where I think the most important thing is not to determine, do we or do we not have adrenal fatigue? That's irrelevant. What is relevant is, where is your adrenal function at? And is that adaptive for what we're hoping to achieve and maintaining optimal health? Very often the answer is no.
Brilliant. And I think what you point out there, well, everything you point out there is incredibly important. I remember dipping into that paper, and essentially they cite study after study where people have abnormal test results for cortisol, and yet that is still the conclusion that they come up with, which I thought was also just quite comical, ultimately.
It's a parody, isn't it? And yet we have actual endocrinologists who, for whatever reason, be it emotional or anything else, are actually referring to this paper as some sort of proof that you can't actually have the test results you have. You can't actually have the problems you've got right now, because this paper says it's not the case. They haven't read the paper. No one would quote it if they'd read it.
Yeah, and it's a good example, kind of, I guess, of the problems we have in sort of in this kind of traditional evidence-based model of going to PubMed and kind of looking for a paper, and if it's not there, it doesn't exist. If there's a paper that confirms it, then we're all ultimately, or most of us, are cherry picking research that's there or not there ultimately. But anyway, we could spend an hour probably just talking about that. But the other thing that I just want to pick on that you mentioned there was sort of the holistic nature of all of this. Adrenal function does not work in silo. So although we're going to be talking about primarily adrenal function today, we've already mentioned we'll be bringing in thyroid function, testosterone, etc. in later episodes of the podcast. But do you want to just maybe touch on like a very brief overview of that kind of interconnection in the body?
Well, yeah, and in that sense, the adrenal question of where is the output at, how is this playing out for this individual, that's always one of the first questions that I would ask when starting to work with somebody, because by definition, if somebody's coming to see me after a sustained period of health challenges, then their system is under stress, whether that's energetic stress or inflammatory stress or oxidative stress, emotional stress. Generally, as soon as one hits a certain threshold, the others follow. So in that sense, we can often see a very similar pattern between a whole variety of individuals with very different needs and very different aims, very different journeys. And yet certain principles so often apply, in that when I'll do a case history, we'll have a number of years whereby there are these little clues, these minor challenges which, you know, they can handle by simply making sure that they eat before bedtime, and that will allow them to sleep, or by taking a painkiller and getting going, or by exercising for X amount of minutes early in the morning, and that will allow them to maintain normal mental focus. All of these little things that indicate that things aren't quite right, but providing they compensate, then all is good. And then at some point, things come crashing down. And often it's a very minor insult to the system that does bring those house of cards tumbling down. And in that sense, one of the best characterized events that's going on there is that something happens that means the adrenal output cannot keep pace with demands. And that's a pretty key thing, because while the body's under increasing stresses with each passing year, most of us will get on okay and maintain what we would consider to be normal-ish well-being. And the reason for that is that our adrenal glands can do a fantastic job of simply pumping out more cortisol helping us to cope with these stresses, helping to maintain mitochondrial function in the midst of inflammation, helping to maintain a adequate sense of calm in the midst of various sensory inputs that are progressively loading the system. It helps us to maintain normal metabolic function in the midst of things that would normally rock us. So it's a great system. And I guess the only thing that is, more impressive than the ability of the human body to cope with various insults is how far we'll push it, because we have that ability. Until, of course, let's say a viral infection comes along, viral infections being fairly unique in the whole world of infections, in that they have the capacity to influence adrenal output more so than usual. So that's not the only thing that can initiate the sort of change we're talking about, but it's very much a classic event. And suddenly these individuals who are doing okay on the basis that their adrenal function work overtime suddenly have that removed from them. Now, in theory, this is designed to be a very temporary thing to aid in the body's response to viral infection. But of course, it only took that brief moment in time because they were so dependent on such a high level of adrenal output to compensate for the various burdens across the system. And now we have seen what we often describe as that crash, at which point we'll often see a kicking in of a whole variety of self-perpetuating cycles, which obviously we can go into, but are mainly characterized by inflammation, loading the system further. We've lost that cortisol control of inflammation, but then because of that, we're seeing impacts on energy signaling. We're seeing direct inflammatory signaling into key parts of the brain. Net combination of low energy and inflammatory signaling is an increased activation of the stress response, which of course is where we see further inflammatory events, either through the CRH mast cell link or through the opening up of the gut lining to get at more sugars and salts. end result being more endotoxins, more inflammation. And we can see this self-perpetuating cycle is now going to play out until that's extinguished. And in doing so, massive effects on thyroid, massive effects on estrogen, testosterone balance, and central nervous system. So kind of a big deal.
What you've just said there is it's worth just going back to for a second, because you've just mentioned what I think is something I'm still, I guess, trying to get my head around and kind of unpick ultimately, which is a lot of the conditions that we hear about, leaky gut or intestinal permeability, are at least sometimes, if not often, an adaptive response. And I think we have to think that the body has a lot more wisdom than the mind. And therefore, the question that we also have to ask is, why might this be an adaptive response? And you've just mentioned there this idea of leaky gut being a potential consequence of adrenal fatigue type conditions as a way of getting more salts and things like this into the system. So is there a way that we can just expand on this to help people understand a little bit more?
Yeah, definitely. And so, in that sense, it's hardly unusual to talk of leaky gut within our world. It's a very common subject of conversation, and very important, because we often talk about the body's response to its environment, and instinctively that's something that makes us think of what's around us, and what's on the other side of this layer we call skin. And in that sense, that's obviously important. And yet I think sometimes the perspective shift can be really helpful when we consider we've got about 2.5 meters squared of skin in contact with the outer environment. But we also have this tube of the outer environment that runs through the middle of our bodies. It's called our GI tract. And we've got about 600 meters squared of membranous tissue in contact with that at all times. So this has a massive say of how does our body respond to its environment, especially our immune system. Now, to get on to the leaky gut, I think what's so helpful to touch on is how there are two types of leaky gut. One seems to get all the credit and the plaudits and the focus, and that talks of when the cells of the gut lining are separated, when the proteins that hold them together are damaged due to inflammatory events and oxidative stress. And in that regard, we're talking about paracellular permeability. That's typically things like dysbiosis-induced inflammation, gluten issues, alcohol, etc. But just as important, and often a real leading cause of chronic endotoxemia, inflammation, which has such a devastating effect across a wide range of areas, is the transcellular permeability. And this is something whereby we actually have these enzymes that work within the cells that line our gut lining. They are SGLT, sugar and glucose linked transfer proteins. And so in that sense, what they do is, when subject to a stress response, they open up channels within the cells. So of course, this is a scenario whereby we can have really good conditions in the gut. We can have very strong proteins holding together the gut lining. We can have a relatively peaceful environment, free of chronic inflammation, etc. But as long as there is that stress response kicking in, we're going to see a very obvious opening of these channels. And the whole idea of that is to get sugars and salts into the bloodstream. These are very valuable resources that help us deal with threats and challenges. And it's an effective way of doing it, but at a cost. And the cost is that endotoxins these little fragments of dead bacteria that live inside the gut, well, they are now going to move into the circulation. And this is endotoxemia. So by endotoxins, you'll sometimes hear them called lipopolysaccharides. So yeah, little just fragments of dead bacteria. They can't infect you, but they do exhibit non-mammalian barcodes. In other words, they are very, very aggravating to the immune system response. The immune system response has been trained through evolution not to take chances, and it doesn't. It sees them and it assumes that the defensive walls have been breached and that there is a risk of sepsis, and responds in kind. And what we see is a very potent inflammatory response, which not only will have massive effects on energy and thus fatigue that we see in these sort of adrenal issues, but also in regards to the sensitivity of various different hormonal receptors. We'll also see change in liver function, and suddenly we're starting to stack up a whole number of dysfunctions that are going to be impossible to resolve with a healthy lifestyle or with a supplement plan. It's not feasible at this stage. This is such a central feature that really throws the individual into metabolic chaos.
Okay. And I think that sort of summarizes nicely the complexity of this, and how we need that holistic, whatever you want to call it, holistic approach and understanding of how all of these different systems work and support one another. And more importantly, how some of these adaptive responses, as you've discussed a couple of times, can become sort of self-fulfilling. Inflammation can feed oxidative stress can feed inflammation, and the examples go on. But bringing us back into, I guess, adrenal function, we've kind of mentioned that there are quite a lot of consequences of the adrenals starting to, I guess, be affected by the burden that has been placed on them through various lifestyle, environmental type loads. And I guess we're talking here about allostatic load and resiliency to some degree. But where shall we take the conversation, Marek, from here? If we're kind of bringing it back to adrenal function, our listeners now have a pretty good understanding of, I guess, the body-centric sort of view on adrenal function. I guess questions that come to mind would be around testing and support ultimately as well.
And so in that sense, the testing that can easily be done is the salivary testing. That has been the most common way that adrenal output has been tested in recent decades. And it's very easy, relatively cheap. You can also run a test through the urinary profiles, for example, the Dutch panel. And that will often come alongside a snapshot of estrogen, testosterone, and the other steroid hormones to boot. So, it is very, very easy to test. I mean, you can do blood testing as well. Downside being that with the salivary and Dutch panels, you can run multiple tests over the course of a single day, which is very important in adrenal function because it's the organ system that contains within it a very obvious diurnal rhythm. It should be higher in the morning and then progressively drop off over the course of the day. And that's very vital, not only to help with our sleep and wake cycles, but allow for coordination of various other systems, notably the immune system. So blood testing can still do a good job, but for most people it is hugely inconvenient to give 4 blood samples over the course of a 12 to 16 hour phase. But in any case, it's very accessible to do these tests. And what that will allow us to see is, are we seeing higher function, higher outputs that's desperately trying to compensate for thing? Are we seeing low outputs where the capacity for production at the adrenals has already suffered. Equally, yeah, we can gain interesting insights by looking at the levels of cortisol relative to DHEA, another crucial hormone within the adrenal cascade. So yeah, that testing is something that can give us a little bit of an insight into, well, what mechanisms may be going on here, and equally can give us a before and an after to let us know exactly how successful the interventions have been.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure I've seen studies on, for example, participants with chronic fatigue syndrome where we do kind of see that. We see with improvement in adrenal test results, we see improvement in their kind of symptoms and level of fatigue. So there's certainly kind of correlational data there as well, as you'd expect ultimately.
Yeah, and I think it's an area that would be so ripe for study, but of course, it's always going to be hampered by the fact that there are no pharmaceutical agents available in order to help with something of this type. And thus we lead on to the same old question, who's going to fund it?
Yeah. And I think what you've already mentioned around kind of chronic infections or certainly viral infections blocking adrenal output runs true. I think I did my master's dissertation on cortisol resistance in chronic fatigue syndrome. So kind of had to, a few years ago, dive into some of this literature. And I think it was in Psychoneuroimmunology, the journal, where they sort of theorized around this, that when we're seeing low free cortisol in salivary testing, is that an adaptive response? Is it trying to free up the immune system to actually deal with an infection that it hasn't been able to successfully deal with, which, if I've understood you, is kind of what you were talking about earlier with infections.
Yeah, so I think what's interesting about the patterns that I touched on earlier is that is an adaptive response, although that is designed to be temporary. Right. The problem, of course, is when we undertake this metabolic shift, the idea being that this will be for a 48-hour or 72-hour stint, in order to enhance the immune system response, allow for a more potent reaction to deal with the threat. But what if in doing so, we then see this falling apart of the communications and initiation of all those self-perpetuating cycles that involve more stress response, more inflammation, more agitation to normal mitochondrial function, and suddenly there are no resources to actually complete the process for which these shifts were initiated to do. In those scenarios, we're not likely to see that clearance of the viral threat. Or sometimes we will, but we've got that hit and run process in play, whereby, well, the self-perpetuating cycle has already been initiated. So at this point, even when the threat is gone, there's just so much inflammation. And then that can obviously be a really big deal, both in regards to the cortisol receptor activity, hugely affected by endotoxemia. That for me would always be one of the first things I would want to look at and work backwards from. In other words, what's causing this? Where can we find leverage to resolve this? But equally, we look at the role of dysregulated inflammation, a whole nother area of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And in that regard, if there is excessive nitric oxide production, we are likely to see a massive reduction in the release of ACTH from the pituitary gland. That's the hormone that the pituitary releases to stimulate the adrenal cortex. Not only that, excessive nitric oxide can actually inhibit the production of steroid hormones, such as cortisol, at the adrenal glands. Equally, anything that disturbs mitochondrial function is a big deal, because there are three hormones that are formed by enzymes within the mitochondria. That's pregnenolone, cortisol, and aldosterone. So suddenly, yeah, we can see a really problematic crisscross of varying dysfunction in the sense that because the adrenals can't produce the hormones they need to quell the stress response at the hypothalamic layer, we see this stress response turned on 24/7. Because it's turned on 24/7, we've got that constant opening up of the gut lining, which means you've got the constant pouring in of endotoxins, constant dysregulation of those cortisol receptors, meaning there's even less negative feedback at the hypothalamus, even less of a calming signal being received, even less of an anti-inflammatory effect of what little cortisol we've got left. And then on top of that, we're seeing, yeah, the inflammatory effects, nitric oxide being a major mediator there that will compete with oxygen. And this is one of the reasons why so many people with chronic issues, chronic fatigue issues, they will show hypoxia markers in their organic acids test results for mitochondrial function. Their iron levels are just fine. All their blood markers are looking good, but you've got too much of that nitric oxide, your mitochondria cannot access the oxygen. And suddenly that's going to affect every single cell in the body, especially those energy intensive areas, front part of the brain being a classic example, but also it's going to affect these key areas within the adrenal cortex, which can now no longer produce what they need to produce to switch off this whole catastrophic self-perpetuating cycle.
Fantastic. I guess the question coming to mind then is, you've mentioned nitric oxides. Can we just touch on, are there any, I guess, sort of more common things that can contribute to excessive levels? Because obviously nitric oxide has fundamental roles to play. So like always, it's not sort of just a bad thing. But what are some of the things that might get us into this situation?
Yeah, so in that regard, it's worthwhile touching on, nitric oxide has some very important and very helpful roles. And the easiest way to delineate, that question, which, as you paraphrase, is it good? Is it bad? We want to avoid that, but is to note that when we're talking about the positive roles that nitric oxide plays in relaxing blood vessels and enhancing circulation across the body, especially in the central nervous system, we're talking about endothelial nitric oxide synthase. That is to say that, the location in which the nitric oxide is produced is going to have a very big impact on the effect that it has. Now, equally, compare that to neuronal nitric oxide, mitochondrial nitric oxide synthase. Yeah, these will generally have different effects. But where our concerns tend to lie is in the inducible nitric oxide synthase. This is released by immune cells to help with inflammatory reactions. When that occurs, well, not only are we going to miss nitric oxide's effect in the areas where it could be helpful, but also, we're now going to see potentially a huge swell of that can compete with oxygen, and depending on antioxidant status, can end up producing a particularly damaging chemical called peroxynitrite, which can now cause oxidative damage, which ironically calls for repair response. That means more immune activity, more inflammation, more nitric oxide, hence the peroxynitrite cycle put forward by Martin Paul a couple of decades ago now, which I think is an interesting aspect to a lot of the scenarios we're looking at. But so depending on which specific enzyme releases the nitric oxide. In exactly which compartment it's released, we can see very helpful effects, or we can see potentially harmful effects.
Brilliant. And I love the context that you give to that, you know, even down to sort of anatomical location of where this gas is being produced matters ultimately. There is no sort of black or white concept there. Okay, so with all that in mind, actually one thing I want to come back to before maybe we start thinking about I guess concluding the conversation from sort of an intervention perspective, maybe what are some of the things that we want to be mindful of there, is you've mentioned that if we use the example of a viral infection, that can essentially create this, let's call it triggering event, whereby these self-perpetuating cycles start, and then essentially we end up with maybe a diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome or whatever it may be. Would you agree that although that's the triggering event, as often it gets called in our world, everything preceding that essentially has almost dictated or certainly contributed to the fact that that infection has been the triggering event? It's had the capacity to have that much of an impact. It's moved the needle from sort of a somewhat healthy homeostatic physiology to now pathophysiology, or a new set point where the body can't get back to where it once was.
Very much so. In that sense, I think it's so helpful to consider, you know, where did these responses evolve, in what environments? And in that sense, yeah, we're looking at environments whereby people would likely have been working about 4 hours a day to satisfy their material needs, would likely have had very enjoyable, peaceful downtime within a nuclear family unit, and then spent the evening with the tribe, so on and so forth, in groups of up to 150. There's a very different world that we are now finding ourselves in. And so in that regard, yeah, it is something that's going to test our abilities to adapt. And in most instances, you know, we are living beyond our budget in that regard, meaning that, yeah, when an acute insult comes along, we previously would have had the resources in reserve to deal with that, to move on and move on in an adaptive fashion and not give it a second thought following that. But yeah, in that sense, when somebody is sleeping 6 hours a night, but it's poor sleep, they're a little wired, they're used to waking up 2-3 times a night, maybe, yeah, they're used to waking up to urinate, and that's just a normal thing. It's hardly unusual. And then, yeah, what happens in the morning? Well, they are hugely tired. They are in a semi-zombie state, and that's okay though, because within a few coffees, they are up to operating speed, and they can kind of sort of get through, well, providing they get that croissant boost at the time they need it, and so on and so forth. So we've got this scenario where, yeah, there's insulin sensitivity issues, there's an excessive stress load, there's insufficient repair. What's incredible is how well the human body manages in these scenarios. And I think it's worth just sharing the recent research. 88% of Americans show some signs of pathological insulin resistance. 88%. So of course, when I'm talking about it's normal now to be metabolically challenged on a daily basis, that's what I'm talking about. And of course, admittedly, you know, we haven't got the exact same data on the British population, and we're probably lagging behind, but we're only ever a few years behind in pretty much all these patterns. But yeah, that's where most people are at. So of course, they have a surgery, or they have a physical accident, or they have mold exposure, or they have a viral infection. These are things that maybe needn't have a devastating impact or leave a long-term legacy. But most people aren't that far away from an insult tipping them into that position. And that's what we're seeing. And as I mentioned earlier, having done this for 16 years and taken my fair share of case histories, it's very relevant that there's always multiple clues in the lead up to the event in question, the crash or the descent into chronic issues. And so the only thing that tends to separate one person from the next is how many years were they able to put up a fight? For how long were they able to keep going in that burdened state? And it's surprising. Some people have managed a long time.
Yeah, I can put my hand up and and talk about some of that as well. I mean, what you mentioned earlier around sometimes people finding or being maybe recommended by you to, have a little snack before bed. And for some, that's revolutionary to their sleep. And it certainly was for me in my kind of mid-20s. I kind of stumbled across the fact that my sleep was really bad. I was waking in the night, struggling to get back to sleep. And I don't know why I did it. And maybe I just one night I felt ravenous or had an overwhelmingly strong craving. And I did. I went to the kitchen, had something to eat, fell asleep within 5 minutes. And that became a thing that I started to notice, which was if I had a little snack, I could fall asleep really quickly. And obviously, as you say, little clues and signs that all is not well.
Yeah.
And that we need a little bit more TLC maybe.
Well, exactly that. And I'm no different. Looking back, I was given a talent, which was to sleep really strong and hard. And during the day, I could set my alarm for 22 minutes because it was 25 minutes till the next appointment. And I would sleep really well. But in doing so, that bought me an opportunity to push things in ways they shouldn't really be pushed. And let a lot of stressful events and burdens build until I paid for it, and I did. It took a lot longer to put things back together than it did to break them. Obviously, there was a learning curve involved in that, and one could say that there's a beneficial use of such lessons these days. But it's something that everybody does, and a lot of the time, there's a societal, financial, cultural need to do so. And that's a bigger conversation. But sometimes there isn't, or a lot of times, yes, there's a need to do so, but we're not compensating for that. How are we, treating ourselves after an intense Monday to Friday session? So, maybe there's better ways to tend to mind, body, and soul than a 12-hour cocaine binge in the city. But that's just my view of one man.
But I think that's a really good point. So something I've said to clients over the years is, the higher you go from, let's just say, a stress response perspective, the lower you need to go with your relaxation. So the idea that you can't work hard and then as your relaxation zone out on Netflix while also being on Instagram, that's not going to recharge the battery to the rate that you've burnt through it. So there needs to be that true ratio in the yin yang sort of thing. And I think that's, again, from a societal perspective, we just have that very wrong, I think, fundamentally.
Well, I think that we all learn Pythagoras' theorem at school, but no one ever at any point in those 5 years of secondary school do we ever talk about tending to our physical needs. This is the platform that is ultimately going to decide, do we have the options to leverage any intellectual prowess that we have? And it's entirely forgotten about. If you're ill, you go to the doctor and take the tablets you're given, and then you get back to work. And equally, yeah, there is definitely something to be said of this inability of our generation more than any other to relax, to be non-productive. And yeah, it's something that I can actively hold my hand over and say that, yeah, I struggled with for a long time because I was always a very productive individual. But yeah, to integrate some very specific non-productive time into my schedule is vital. And I think it helps during the transition where it feels weird, where suddenly, yeah, we're not being stimulated, we're not having our bells rung by various forms of sensory inputs and, you know, this stimulation that surrounds us 24/7. But when you take that away, it doesn't always feel nice. And that, I think, is a really big challenge. And it is something that I think most people with any sort of chronic challenges will experience at some point when we take the adrenaline away, when we take the continual commitment to being busy, being productive, when we actually strip that down. You know, what have we got? We have us and what we're feeling at the time. And yeah, if we've not tended to that for many, many years, which of course, you know, we won't do if we're scrolling through Instagram while we're on the toilet. You know, we're watching YouTube videos whilst brushing our teeth. There's no stop to it. Yeah, if that's the case, there's going to be a backlog. And yeah, what's needed isn't necessarily what feels good, at least in the short term.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it is a reflection of that bigger issue. And yeah, I think it's very easy to forget that and think, right, what do we do for adrenals? Well, it's licorice, it's Korean ginseng, rhodiola. And these are fantastic tools. These are tools I use all the time, but I don't expect that these are going to be what takes somebody to the point they want to be at. I think they're going to be a very important tool.
Yeah. And to some degree, they're a luxurious tool. You know, what I mean by that is they're not, well, for the majority of people, they're probably not even absolutely needed. You know, they're supplementary to everything that you've just been discussing, which is, well, can we get off Instagram while on the toilets? And can we start to process what's going on in our minds rather than just being in constant fight or flight or distraction mode? And I think, those bread and butter things, I honestly think sometimes, and this comes through my own sort of health journey as well, they're so simplistic that I think we brush them off as, well, it's simplistic, it's not going to have any real bearing on how I heal or recover or optimal health. But they're the foundations to it.
Well, yeah, and there's a couple of things that I want to touch on there. And firstly, but yeah, is the fact that it is too simplistic, but also most people will feel slightly worse for actually engaging in these processes of active rest, introspection, and tending to themselves and what messages are contained within their central nervous system. So in that sense, there's no instant reward. In actual fact, it's the opposite. So very, very little incentive there. And that makes sense because, what do we do as humans? We learn through association. So we end up making a change. 5-6 days in, we think, do you know what? This hasn't done anything. It feels like a lot of effort and I don't want to do this. I'm not motivated to do this. So why would I continue? And in that sense, yeah, that is, I think, a potentially important role of a practitioner to not only set expectations and explain, what we expect in terms of timelines, in terms of what metrics we can use for assurance. Things like heart rate variability start coming into play there, when people can actually see concrete, measurable changes in their physiology. Or maybe it's sleep tracking, and they can see, okay, well, I feel a little bit zombie-like when I don't run around full of adrenaline all day, every day. I might not feel so good, but wow, what a difference in my sleep. What a difference in these metrics. So in that sense, yeah, our role can be quite important in allowing people to recognize what this is doing, but also to understand why taking away a lot of these numbing agents such as adrenaline will see them feel different. And naturally, it's unusual that will immediately see them jump straight to bliss, which is, as a society, that's what we want. But equally, yeah, the other thing is, that combination of nutritional support and lifestyle change. I think this is a really central piece to tending to the human body in times when things have gone off track. And in that sense, okay, we can change our mindset. We can start a new schedule of daily meditation. We can start doing yoga. We can do all of these things, and there is a lot of value in that. But what I've always found interesting is how it's really tough to leverage any benefits from those processes without tending to these major obstacles. In other words, if your physiology is pumping out 11, 12 times the amount of adrenaline that it should, you're not going to be able to meditate. Your body and brain have evolved to ensure that you do not and cannot meditate whilst running from a tiger, because that would not promote survival. So it's impossible. And I myself have experienced this. I was in a moldy flat and had two hits on my spine in the same week, and my sleep fell apart. My metabolism went with it. Took a while to put that all back in to a place that worked to my satisfaction. But in any case, I'd been meditating for a while before that, and suddenly I had no ability to do so. So I was aware that, unlike the internet guru idea of, of course it's the ego that it doesn't want you to let go, and you just got to practice it, let go and all of that. Of course, maybe there's something important in that, but if your physiology is tilted into a stance that is imploring for you to remain vigilant, to maintain an external focus, well, how are you ever going to go internal and tend to that? That's only something that can be undertaken after the event. So in that sense, I would always expect that these processes, while extremely valuable, are not likely to yield the benefits that we ascribe to them until we give that person a fair chance. So in that sense, I will likely see someone, in fact, every person that comes to see me, I will ask them to do an organic acids test before doing so. And almost everyone is going to have certain obstacles that impact on mitochondrial function. Now, if that's the case, well, A, we're going to see a direct impact on energy availability. B, we're going to see secondary consequences. The less the mitochondria can take from the bloodstream, the less they will take, the more we'll have to send back. That's insulin resistance, huge connection there. That's now changes in energy signals. That's impacts on the actual anatomical activation of the central nervous system. We now have a brain that actually doesn't have activity in the areas we need to be active to yield benefits from this. And this is just mitochondrial function. Then we're also looking at the hormonal signals, cortisol being such a big deal, not only its production, but also that sensitivity of the receptors, as you mentioned. If both of those are unattended to, how could we possibly switch off the stress response? How could we possibly expect to gain any control of the inflammatory cascade? In any case, yeah, often it will take a couple of rounds, sometimes 3 rounds, in order to leverage some sort of scaffolding to suddenly quell that self-perpetuating cycle, and mean that those signals that were previously telling the brain that we are under threat, we are under siege, suddenly they are silenced. And that's where there's no longer an obstacle standing between somebody and, yeah, getting in touch with actual rest, with introspection, and, yeah, tending to their body's needs, because they can now receive the messages that are being sent, but would otherwise be numbed by adrenaline and a whole host of other stress hormones.
Brilliant. Okay, so with all that in mind, all of what you just said for the last 45 minutes, it's obviously very important to take a personalized approach to anything and everything on this. But apart from what we've already mentioned around, without obviously having any context of an individual here, but essentially slowing down, having some time for introspection if it's possible, thinking about just limiting our distractions, etc. What are there any kind of, let's say, general go-tos that when we're thinking about adrenal function, adrenal fatigue, burnout, that everyone needs to be thinking about?
Well, yeah, and I think it comes down to making a checklist of what obvious obstacles do we have in play. So, of course, that's life stresses. That's number one. Anything that is going to elicit, a threat to the system. And I think in that regard, it's worthwhile mentioning, we talk a lot about the stress response, so much so that sometimes the phrase almost becomes meaningless. So yeah, let's take a step back and say, well, what is the stress response there for? What's its primary focus? And its primary focus is to ensure there is increased availability of energy in circulation so that you can better meet the demands that the brain expects to be placed upon you. And on top of that, there are secondary effects on vigilance, which makes sense. But yeah, a lot of it is all about energy. So of course, in that sense, we do need to recognize it's not all about the adrenaline induced heart pumping out of our chest in an extreme moment of emotional challenge. There's more to it than that. If you're working 16 hours a day, that's placing your body under major stress. The brain is a exceptionally energy intensive organ. You can't squeeze that juice for 16 hours a day without mounting a potent stress response to sustain that. And of course, yeah, we're talking about the potential cost of leaning on that day after day. And yeah, in that regard, if you are undertaking a schedule, you're undertaking challenges that you think anybody else in your life would find extremely stressful, but you don't, recognize it's still stressful. The difference there is you're just not feeling it, which is very common when the adrenaline's high, the opioids are high. Yeah, that's a very effective part of the stress response to numb us, to what would otherwise destabilize in the midst of trying to reach safety. So yeah, so we've got that actual load, whether it be emotional, be it energetic, scheduling, but also then it's the basics like sleep. It is the basics like balancing blood sugar levels. If you are having nothing but coffee until 2 p.m. in the afternoon, that's a thing. And yeah, there's probably benefit in touching on intermittent fasting at this point, something that has such a massive list of very well characterized benefits, and it's an extremely useful tool. But if the body's already under a major stress load through other reasons that we've touched on, intermittent fasting is still a stressor. And that's a concern that, I think is worth touching on, especially because a lot of people feel that they are so busy in the morning that, hey, well, this is a healthy thing, right? So let's just skip breakfast because I don't have time for it anyway, and I'll pat myself on the back for doing so. So again, I'm not saying intermittent fasting is good or bad, but it can definitely add to that burden if, we're not cautious of how often it's deployed, the circumstances in which it's deployed. So yeah, blood sugar level management, sleep quality, inflammation. The gut is obviously a very, very sensible focal point there. So in that sense, what is the diet like? Are you getting gut symptoms? Is there constipation or loose stools on a regular basis? Is there lots of gas or discomfort? If so, well, we know something's up there. That's worthwhile focusing, because that inflammatory burden constantly asks your adrenals to do more. Plus, we know there's a certain point where dysregulated inflammation can topple the ability of the adrenal cortex to keep on doing its thing. It can also topple the ability of the receptors to respond to those signals. So I think that those would be a really good starting point if we were to simply look at what can we take away before we start adding things. But equally, adding things is often a really important part of things, and often that's supplementation. I think it does have a very important role, not necessarily something that's needed for people that are in a decentish place, but once things have crashed, it's almost always something that will need to break the cycles that would otherwise run amok.
Brilliant. Marek, there's been so much information that I feel like I need to go and listen back to this myself. So thank you so much for sharing all of your experience, your knowledge, your wisdom. You have articulated a lot of those messages brilliantly. So thank you.
Oh, thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. I'm looking forward to part 2, 3, and hopefully 4 over the coming months.
Yeah, let's do that.
All right. Thanks, Marek.
Thank you.